The conference room fell silent as the board members stared at the financial report spread across the mahogany table. My former supervisor leaned back in his leather chair, arms crossed, that same smug expression he'd worn 6 months ago when he'd thrown me out of the office building into the pouring rain, screaming that I was finished in this industry. He had no idea that the woman he'd humiliated, the junior analyst he'd stolen credit from and then discarded, was now sitting across from him as the primary consultant hired by the new ownership group. He definitely had no idea that the elderly gentleman in the impeccable suit, sitting at the head of the table, the man who'd just acquired controlling interest in the company, was my uncle. Before this story truly begins, please leave us a comment telling us which state or city you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can grow and bring you more compelling stories. That morning 6 months ago had started like any other brutal day at Westbrook Financial Group. I arrived at the glass tower in downtown Seattle at 6:30 in the morning, a full hour before anyone else on my team. The sky was already threatening rain, thick clouds rolling in from Puget Sound, turning the morning light gray and oppressive. I'd grown accustomed to arriving early during my 2 years at Westbrook, not because I was particularly ambitious in that corporate climbing way, but because it was the only time I could work in peace. My name is Shanice Wellington, though back then I went by my married name, Shanice Morrison. I was 28 years old, a financial analyst who'd graduated top of her class from Howard University with a degree in economics. I'd married my college sweetheart, moved to Seattle for his medical residency, and landed what I thought was a dream position at one of the city's most prestigious investment firms. What I didn't know then was that dreams could turn into nightmares with such subtle cruelty that you don't realize you're trapped until it's far too late. The office was dark and quiet when I entered, my heels clicking against the polished marble floors. I loved these early morning hours when the aggressive energy of the trading floor hadn't yet invaded the space, when I could spread my research across my desk without someone hovering over my shoulder, questioning my methodology or dismissing my conclusions before I'd even finished presenting them. I made coffee in the break room, the expensive kind that the senior partners kept locked in the cabinet, using the key I'd been given when I first started. Back then, being trusted with the coffee key had felt like an honor, a sign that I was valued. Now I understood it for what it was, a minor privilege designed to make you feel included, while the real decisions happened behind doors you'd never be invited through. I settled at my desk with my coffee and opened the file I'd been working on for the past 3 months. It was a comprehensive analysis of emerging market opportunities in renewable energy, specifically focusing on solar technology companies in developing nations that were positioned for explosive growth. The research was meticulous, over 400 pages of data analysis, risk assessment, projected returns, and strategic recommendations. I'd worked nights and weekends on this project, sacrificing time with my husband, missing family gatherings, neglecting friendships. My marriage had already been strained, my husband's demanding residency schedule, leaving us like ships passing in a perpetually dark night, and this project had only widened that distance. But I'd told myself it would be worth it. This analysis was groundbreaking, the kind of work that could establish my reputation in the industry, that could prove I belonged in those closed-door meetings where the real power brokers made their decisions. I'd presented preliminary findings to my supervisor 3 weeks earlier, a man named Demetrius Hartwell, who'd been with Westbrook for 15 years and had positioned himself as a champion of diversity and mentorship. He was in his late 40s, always impeccably dressed, always ready with an encouraging word in public settings. He'd told me my work was impressive, that it showed real promise, that he wanted me to keep developing it. He'd said we'd present it together to the executive committee, that this could be my breakthrough moment. I'd believed him. God, how naive I'd been. I heard the elevator ding around 7:30 and felt my stomach tighten. Through the glass walls of my cubicle, I could see Demetrius stepping out, looking unusually energized for this early in the morning. He was carrying his leather portfolio, the expensive one his wife had given him for their anniversary, and he was on his phone laughing about something. He saw me and ended his call, heading directly to my desk. His smile was wide and warm, the smile that had made me trust him in the first place. "Shanice, you're here early," he said, leaning against the partition of my cubicle. "I wanted to talk to you before the day gets crazy." My heart lifted with hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe he was going to tell me when we'd be presenting to the executive committee. Maybe my hard work was finally about to pay off. "I've been reviewing your renewable energy analysis," he continued, and something in his tone made my optimism falter. "It's good work, really solid research, but I think it needs some refinement before we can present it to the executives." I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. "What kind of refinement? I'm happy to revise whatever needs adjustment." He pulled up a chair and sat down, his expression becoming serious and paternal. "Here's the thing, Shanice. You're talented, no question about that. But you're still early in your career. In this industry, it's all about relationships and credibility. The executive committee, they need to hear this from someone with more established credentials." The coffee in my hand suddenly felt cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'd like to take the lead on presenting this analysis. I'll give you full credit as the research associate, of course, but I think the message will land better coming from someone at my level. It's politics, you understand? It's about getting your good work the attention it deserves." Research associate. The word stung like a slap. I'd conceived this project, designed the methodology, conducted every interview, analyzed every data point, written every word. Now I was being reduced to a research associate, a supporting player in my own work. "Demetrius, this is my project," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and professional, even as anger began to burn in my chest. "I appreciate the mentorship, but I think I should be the one presenting it. Or at the very least, we should present it together, as you originally suggested." His expression shifted, the warmth draining from his eyes and leaving something harder in its place. "Shanice, I'm trying to help you here. Don't let pride get in the way of what's best for your career." "It's not pride," I said, feeling my voice rise slightly despite my efforts to control it. "It's my work, my analysis, my recommendations. I deserve to present it." He stood up, and suddenly the power dynamic in the room shifted dramatically. He was no longer my mentor offering fatherly advice. He was my superior, and I had just challenged him. "You deserve what I say you deserve," he said quietly, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "You're a junior analyst. You work on projects I assign to you. If I determine that a project needs to be presented by someone with more seniority, that's my decision to make, not yours." I felt my hands beginning to shake. "Are you seriously going to pretend you came up with this research? That you did this work?" "I'm not pretending anything," he said, his tone hardening. "Further, I supervised this project. I provided guidance and direction. That makes me the lead on any presentation. And if you have a problem with that, we can discuss it with human resources." The threat was clear. Challenge him and face consequences that could destroy my career before it had really begun. I should have backed down right then. I should have swallowed my anger and played the political game he was demanding. But something in me, some core of self-respect that I'd inherited from my grandmother who'd marched in civil rights protests, from my mother who'd fought her way into corporate America in the 80s, refused to let me bow to this injustice. "I do have a problem with it," I said, standing up to face him. "And yes, let's discuss it with human resources. Because what you're describing is intellectual theft, and I'm not going to stand by and watch you take credit for my work." His face flushed with anger, and for a moment I saw genuine hatred flash in his eyes. "You want to go to HR? Fine, let's go right now. Let's see how that works out for a junior analyst who's accusing a senior partner of theft with absolutely no proof beyond her word against mine." The realization hit me like ice water. He was right about the proof. I'd done all the work on my company computer, saved all the files on the company server, conducted all my research using company resources. There was no way to prove that this analysis was mine and not his. It would be my word against his, a 28-year-old analyst against a 15-year veteran, and we both knew who the company would believe. But I couldn't back down now. I'd already committed to this confrontation, and retreating would only make me look weak and foolish. "Then let's go," I said, grabbing my bag. "Let's have that conversation right now." We walked to human resources together, the early morning office still mostly empty. a few people arriving and looking at us curiously as we passed. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Chen, wasn't in yet, but her assistant agreed to page her. We waited in uncomfortable silence in a small conference room, Demetrius on his phone, me staring at the generic corporate art on the walls and wondering if I'd just committed career suicide. Patricia arrived 20 minutes later, looking surprised to see both of us there so early. She was in her mid-50s, competent and professional, the kind of HR director who'd navigated countless corporate conflicts and knew exactly how to protect the company's interests above all else. We presented our cases, Demetrius going first with a calm, reasonable tone that made me sound hysterical by contrast. He explained that he'd been supervising a research project, that I'd done good work as a research associate, but that I was now inappropriately trying to claim full credit for a team effort and exclude him from presenting the findings. When it was my turn, I tried to explain that this had been my project from conception to completion, that he was attempting to steal my work, but even to my own ears, I sounded defensive and emotional. Patricia listened to both of us, taking notes, asking careful questions. Finally, she turned to me with an expression of practiced sympathy. Shanice, I understand you feel very invested in this project, and your contributions are certainly valued. But it's not unusual in this industry for junior analysts to conduct research under the supervision of senior partners who then present the findings. That's part of the learning process and how the firm operates. But he's not just presenting the findings, I protested. He's claiming the work as his own, erasing my contribution entirely. That's not accurate, Demetrius interjected smoothly. I've explicitly said I'll credit Shanice as the research associate. I'm simply taking the lead on the presentation, which is appropriate given our respective positions in the firm. Patricia nodded as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. I think that's a fair compromise, Shanice. You'll receive credit for your research, and Demetrius will handle the presentation to the executive committee. I don't see any policy violation here. I felt the walls closing in around me. This was it, the moment where I could either accept the injustice and maintain my position at the firm, or push back harder and risk everything. What if I disagree with this decision? I asked quietly. Patricia's expression grew stern. Then I'd suggest you think very carefully about your priorities and your future with this company. Demetrius is trying to mentor you and help you succeed, and you're responding with accusations and hostility. That's not the kind of team player attitude we value at Westbrook. The message was crystal clear. Accept your place or suffer the consequences. I looked at Demetrius and saw the satisfaction in his eyes, barely concealed behind a mask of professional concern. He'd won, and he knew it. I'd been outmaneuvered by someone who understood the corporate game far better than I did. I need some time to think, I said, standing up. May I be excused? Patricia nodded, clearly relieved that I was backing down. Take the morning. Come back this afternoon and we'll discuss how to move forward productively. I walked out of that conference room feeling like I'd been physically beaten. The elevator ride down to the lobby seemed to take forever. My reflection in the mirrored walls showing a woman I barely recognized, someone who looked defeated and small. I walked out into the Seattle morning, and the rain that had been threatening finally began to fall, light at first and then heavier, soaking through my blazer and chilling me to the bone. I didn't know where I was going. I just walked, letting the rain wash over me, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from my husband, asking where I was, if everything was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. How could I explain that I'd just watched my career implode because I had dared to stand up for myself? How could I tell him that all those nights I'd chosen work over our marriage had been for nothing? That my big breakthrough project was being stolen from me and there was nothing I could do about it? I ended up in a coffee shop several blocks from the office, shivering and soaked, ordering a hot chocolate I didn't want just to have a reason to sit there. I pulled out my phone and stared at it, part of me wanting to call my mother, part of me too ashamed to admit what had happened. My mother had warned me about corporate America, about how the game was rigged, about how people would smile in your face while stabbing you in the back. I'd thought I was different, that my education and talent would protect me, that merit actually mattered. What a fool I'd been. It was while I was sitting there, spiraling into despair, that I made a decision that would change everything. Though I didn't know it yet, I wasn't going to go back that afternoon. I wasn't going to accept their version of how this story ended. I was going to fight, even if it meant burning bridges and destroying my career at Westbrook. At least I'd go down with my dignity intact. I called Patricia from the coffee shop and told her I was taking a sick day, that I'd be back tomorrow to discuss next steps. Then I went home to my empty apartment, my husband still at the hospital for another 12-hour shift, and I began documenting everything. I wrote down every conversation I'd had with Demetrius about the project, every email exchange, every meeting where I'd presented findings. I backed up all my personal notes and early drafts that I'd worked on at home on my personal laptop. I gathered evidence that might prove this work was mine, even knowing it probably wouldn't be enough. And then I did something that felt both crazy and necessary. I reached out to a former colleague who'd left Westbrook 6 months earlier under mysterious circumstances, a woman named Keisha Brooks, who'd been one of the firm's rising stars until she'd suddenly resigned. I'd always suspected there was more to that story, and now I wondered if she'd faced something similar to what I was experiencing. Keisha agreed to meet me the next day at a restaurant far from the financial district. When I arrived, I was shocked by how different she looked from the polished professional I remembered. She seemed lighter somehow, less burdened, even though she told me she'd struggled to find work after leaving Westbrook. They blackballed me, she explained over coffee, spread rumors that I was difficult to work with, that I had performance issues, all because I threatened to expose the fact that my supervisor had been taking credit for my work for years. My heart sank. Demetrius Hartwell? She nodded grimly. He's done this to at least 3 women that I know of, probably more. He targets analysts who are talented but don't have powerful connections, people he thinks won't fight back or won't be believed if they do. It's his pattern. Why didn't you report him? Why didn't you fight? Keisha laughed bitterly. I did fight, Shanice. I went to HR just like you did. I went to the executive committee. I even considered going to the press. But Demetrius has been at that firm for 15 years. He's got relationships with everyone who matters. And I was just another angry black woman making accusations without proof. So they gave me a choice: resign quietly with a severance package and a neutral reference, or be terminated for cause and have my reputation destroyed. I took the severance and got out. I felt sick. So there's no way to stop him, no way to hold him accountable. Not through official channels, Keisha said. The system is designed to protect people like him, not people like us. But there might be another way. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. Document everything you can, and when he presents your work to the executive committee, make sure you're there to witness it. Record it if you can, though be careful about that legally. Then take that documentation to the press, to industry watchdogs, to professional ethics boards. You probably won't get your job back, but you might prevent him from doing this to someone else. It was a scorched earth strategy, one that would almost certainly end my career at Westbrook and possibly damage my reputation industry-wide, but it was also the only form of justice available to me. I thanked Keisha for her honesty and went home to make a decision. The next week passed in a strange fog of normal routine, masking extraordinary tension. I went to work each day, performed my regular duties, and watched Demetrius prepare to present my research to the executive committee. He'd made some minor changes to the analysis, adding his own introduction and framing, but the core work was entirely mine. Every conclusion and recommendation lifted directly from my research without meaningful modification. I documented everything as Keisha had suggested. I saved copies of all the original files with their timestamps showing when I'd created them. I backed up email chains showing the evolution of the project. I even started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with Demetrius, noting how he'd exclude me from meetings about the presentation, how he'd casually mention the project to other partners as his own work, how he'd begin referring to it as the Hartwell analysis in casual conversation. The presentation to the executive committee was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, and I wasn't invited to attend. This didn't surprise me, but it did make my plan more complicated. I needed to be there to witness what happened, to see with my own eyes how he would present my work. I knew the executive conference room was on the 42nd floor, and I knew the presentation was scheduled for 2 o'clock. What I didn't know was how I'd get into that room without being noticed or thrown out. The solution came from an unexpected source. Jamal, one of the IT support staff who I'd always been friendly with, had heard rumors about what was happening. He approached me Thursday afternoon with a proposition. "There's a storage closet next to the executive conference room," he told me quietly. "It's used for AV equipment. The walls aren't soundproof, and if you're in there, you can hear everything that happens in the meeting. The door locks from the inside, so once you're in, nobody can interrupt you. I can make sure you have access." I was touched by his willingness to help me and also troubled by it. "Jamal, this could get you in trouble too. I can't ask you to risk your job." He shook his head firmly. "I've seen what Demetrius does. He did something similar to my sister at another firm 3 years ago. She left the industry entirely because of it. If I can help you hold him accountable even a little bit, I'm going to do it." So that's how I found myself on Friday afternoon, hidden in a storage closet next to the executive conference room, my phone set to record audio, my heart pounding as I heard the meeting begin on the other side of the wall. I could hear Demetrius's voice clearly as he greeted the executive committee members, his tone confident and charismatic. He made some opening remarks about the firm's need to identify emerging opportunities in sustainable energy markets, then launched into the presentation of findings that were entirely based on my research. What struck me most wasn't the theft itself, which I'd been expecting, but the absolute shamelessness with which he claimed the work as his own. He didn't say "we found" or "our team discovered." He said "I identified, and my analysis shows, and my recommendation is." He'd erased me completely, as if I'd never existed, as if my 3 months of exhaustive work had been his effort all along. Listen to the entire presentation, my phone recording every word, my hands clenched into fists as I fought the urge to burst through that door and confront him in front of everyone. The executive committee members were impressed. I could hear it in their questions and comments. They praised his insight, his thorough research, his strategic thinking. One of them even suggested this analysis could be the foundation for a new division within the firm, with Demetrius heading it up. When the meeting ended, I stayed hidden in the storage closet, waiting until I heard everyone leave and the hallway fall silent. Then I slipped out and returned to my desk, feeling hollow and furious in equal measure. I had the recording. I had all my documentation. I had evidence that could prove what he'd done. But I also knew that evidence might not matter, that the corporate world had its own rules that had nothing to do with truth or justice. I was transferring the recording from my phone to my laptop when Demetrius appeared at my cubicle. He was practically glowing with success, his smile wide and genuine. "Shanice," he said warmly, "the presentation went amazingly well. The executive committee was very impressed with the research. I made sure to mention your contributions during the Q&A session." It was such a casual, effortless lie. I'd heard the entire presentation and the Q&A that followed. He hadn't mentioned me once. "I'm glad it went well," I said, keeping my voice neutral. He studied me for a moment, and I saw a flicker of something calculating in his eyes. "You know, Shanice, I hope there are no hard feelings about how this project worked out. This is just how the industry operates. You'll understand that better as you gain more experience." "I understand perfectly," I said, and I did. I understood that he was a predator who'd found a system that protected and rewarded his predatory behavior. I understood that he felt no remorse whatsoever for what he'd done to me, and to the other women who'd come before me. And I understood that playing by the rules of his system would never lead to justice. He seemed satisfied with my response and left, probably heading out to celebrate his triumph. I sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen, trying to decide what to do next. I could do what Keisha had suggested and take my evidence to the press, to ethics boards, to anyone who might listen. Or I could simply resign and walk away, cut my losses, and try to rebuild my career somewhere else. Neither option felt like justice. Neither option felt like winning. I was still sitting there, paralyzed by indecision, when my phone rang. It was my husband, his voice tight with stress. Shanice, we need to talk. Can you come home? Something in his tone made my stomach drop. This wasn't about dinner plans or household logistics. This was serious. I'm on my way, I said, grabbing my things and heading for the elevator. The conversation I was about to have would turn out to be almost as devastating as the betrayal at work, another foundation crumbling beneath my feet on the same terrible day. My husband was waiting in our living room when I got home, still wearing his scrubs from the hospital, his expression grave. He didn't stand up when I entered, didn't greet me with his usual kiss. He just sat there looking at me with something that might have been pity or guilt or both. What's wrong? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, already bracing for impact. I've been offered a fellowship, he said. At Johns Hopkins, it's an incredible opportunity, exactly the specialization I've been working toward. I should have been happy for him. This was something he'd been dreaming about for years, but the way he said it, the weight in his voice, told me there was more coming. That's wonderful, I said carefully, sitting down across from him. When would it start? 2 months, and Shanice, it's in Baltimore. We'd have to move. The apartment suddenly felt very cold. Move? We just got settled here. My job, my career. I can't just pack up and leave right now. I know, he said, and then he took a breath and delivered the killing blow. That's why I think we should separate, at least for now, while I do the fellowship. We've been growing apart for months anyway. You know that as well as I do. I did know it, but hearing him say it out loud, hearing him propose the end of our marriage so calmly and rationally, felt like being stabbed. You want a divorce, I said flatly. I didn't say divorce, I said separate. Take some time apart, let me focus on this fellowship, let you focus on your career, and then maybe, if it feels right, we can try again. It was a kindness wrapped in cruelty, a way of ending things without actually ending them, leaving me in limbo with no clear path forward. Part of me wanted to fight for our marriage, to beg him to stay or to try to make long distance work. But another part of me, the part that was tired of fighting, losing battles, just wanted it to be over. When do you leave? I asked. 6 weeks. I'll start looking for a sublet in Baltimore. We can figure out what to do with this place, whether you want to stay or find something smaller. The practical arrangements of dismantling a life together. It all felt so clinical, so emotionless, as if our 5 years of marriage were just a lease to be terminated and possessions to be divided. I nodded slowly, feeling numb. Okay. Thank you for being honest with me. He looked relieved, which somehow made it worse. He'd been worried I'd make a scene or beg or cry, and when I didn't, he was grateful for how easy I was making this for him. After he left the room, I sat alone in our living room, surrounded by the furniture we'd picked out together, the art we'd collected, the life we'd built. Everything was falling apart at once, my career and my marriage, both crumbling in the span of a single week. That's when I made the phone call that would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. I called my mother, and for the first time since I'd left for college 10 years earlier, I broke down completely and told her everything. I told her about Demetrius stealing my work, about the executive presentation, about my husband leaving, about feeling like a complete failure at 28 years old with nothing to show for all my effort and sacrifice. My mother listened without interrupting, and when I'd finally cried myself out, she said something that surprised me. Come home for the weekend. Your uncle wants to see you. My uncle, Marcus Wellington, was a figure of legend in our family, though I'd only met him a handful of times in my life. He was my mother's older brother, a man who'd built a fortune in commercial real estate and private equity investment, but who kept a very low profile, preferring privacy to publicity. He'd helped pay for my college education through a trust he'd set up, but we'd never been close, and I wasn't sure why my mother thought seeing him now would help. Mom, I don't think this is the right time for a family visit. I'm a mess. Trust me, baby, come home this weekend. Your uncle specifically asked for you. When I mentioned you were going through a hard time, he has something he wants to discuss with you. There was something in her tone that made me curious despite my exhaustion. I agreed to fly home to Atlanta that weekend, using personal days I'd been saving for a vacation that would now never happen. The flight from Seattle to Atlanta gave me time to think, to process everything that had happened, and to consider what my next moves should be. I had a recording of Demetrius presenting my work as his own, but was it enough? Would anyone care? Would exposing him be worth the cost to my own reputation and career prospects? By the time I landed in Atlanta, I still didn't have answers, only a bone-deep weariness and a cynicism about justice and fairness that I'd never felt before. My mother picked me up from the airport and drove me directly to my uncle's estate in Buckhead, a sprawling property behind high walls that I'd only visited once before, at a family reunion when I was 15. The house was even more impressive than I remembered, a modern masterpiece of glass and stone surrounded by manicured gardens. My uncle greeted us at the door himself, surprising me. He was in his early 60s, tall and distinguished, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Shanice," he said, embracing me warmly. "I'm sorry we're seeing each other under these circumstances. Come in, let's talk." We settled in his study, a room lined with books and art that probably cost more than my annual salary. My mother excused herself, leaving us alone, and my uncle poured us both glasses of excellent bourbon. "Your mother tells me you're having trouble at work," he began, without preamble. "Someone's stealing credit for your research." I was surprised by how much my mother had shared, but I gave him the full story, holding nothing back. I told him about the renewable energy analysis, about Demetrius's betrayal, about the executive presentation and the recording I'd made. I even told him about my marriage ending and how everything seemed to be collapsing at once. He listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, his expression growing darker as the story progressed. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "Do you know what I do, Shanice?" he asked finally. "I acquire companies. I find firms that have strong fundamentals but poor leadership, buy controlling interest, and restructure them. It's been very lucrative." I nodded, wondering where he was going with this. "Westbrook Financial Group came across my desk 3 months ago," he continued. "One of my analysts flagged it as a potential acquisition target. The firm has talented people and good client relationships, but there are rumors of toxic culture and talent retention issues. Several promising analysts have left under questionable circumstances recently, the kind of pattern that suggests deeper problems." My heart began to beat faster. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've been quietly acquiring shares in Westbrook through several investment vehicles. As of last week, I have enough to force significant changes if I choose to. And after hearing what you've just told me, I'm inclined to choose exactly that." I stared at him, not quite believing what I was hearing. "You're going to buy Westbrook?" "I'm going to take control and interest in Clean House, but I need someone I trust to help me identify exactly what's rotten and what's worth keeping. Someone who understands the culture from the inside and has good judgment about talent and character. Someone like you." The offer hung in the air between us, almost too good to be true. "You want me to come work for you?" "I want you to be my consultant on this. Acquisition. You'll have full authority to investigate, to interview people, to make recommendations about personnel and structure. And when we implement changes, you'll have a permanent position in the restructured firm at whatever level your talent merits, not whatever level some insecure supervisor decides you deserve." It was everything I'd wanted: justice and opportunity and validation all wrapped together. But it also felt dangerous, like a trap that might blow up in my face. If I do this, Demetrius will know I'm behind it. It'll look like revenge. "It is revenge," my uncle said bluntly. "Revenge is justice pursued through means available to you. But it's also much more than that. It's about fixing a broken system, about making sure other talented people don't get exploited the way you were. Is that something you want to be part of?" I thought about Keisha, forced to resign after trying to expose similar abuse. I thought about the other women Demetrius had targeted over the years, their careers damaged or destroyed. I thought about the next junior analyst he'd groom and exploit and discard once she'd served his purposes. Yes, I said, I want to be part of that. My uncle smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who'd just identified prey. Good. Then let's begin. I want you to go back to Seattle on Monday and act like nothing has changed. Continue documenting everything and start identifying the people at that firm who are worth keeping and who need to go. We'll make our move in 30 days. I flew back to Seattle on Sunday evening, feeling like a completely different person than I had been a week ago. I was still angry, still hurt by the betrayals I'd experienced, but I no longer felt powerless. I had a plan now, and more importantly, I had resources and support. The next month was the strangest of my life. I went to work each day at Westbrook, performing my regular duties, being pleasant and professional to Demetrius, even as I documented every instance of misconduct I witnessed or heard about. I quietly reached out to other analysts, especially other women and people of color, and asked careful questions about their experiences at the firm. The patterns that emerged were deeply disturbing. Demetrius wasn't the only senior partner exploiting junior staff, though he seemed to be the worst offender. There was a culture of taking credit for others' work, of pushing out talented people who threatened established power structures, of promoting mediocrity that knew how to play politics over excellence that didn't. I compiled detailed reports and sent them to my uncle through encrypted channels. He used this information to strengthen his position with other shareholders, arguing that the firm's talent retention problems were rooted in leadership failures that required dramatic intervention. My personal life continued its painful dissolution. My husband found a sublet in Baltimore and began moving his things out of our apartment. We were cordial to each other, even kind, but the emotional connection between us had frayed beyond repair. I realized that while the timing of our separation felt brutal, it was probably inevitable that we'd been growing apart for years and had just been too busy to notice. In a strange way, having my marriage end at the same time as my career crisis was almost a relief. I could rebuild everything at once rather than trying to maintain one area of stability while the other collapsed. 3 weeks into my consultancy with my uncle, Demetrius called me into his office for what he described as a career development conversation. I knew immediately that something had changed. His energy was different, more calculated and cautious. Shanice, I wanted to check in with you, he began, his tone artificially warm. I know the last few weeks have been difficult with the renewable energy project and all, but I want you to know that I see real potential in you, and I'd like to discuss your career trajectory here at Westbrook. It was such obvious manipulation, and I wondered what had prompted it. Had he heard rumors about my uncle's acquisition plans? Or was this just standard procedure, neutralizing potential threats by offering just enough advancement to keep them grateful and compliant? I appreciate that, I said carefully. What did you have in mind? I'm putting together a new team to pursue opportunities in sustainable energy investment based on the analysis we presented to the executive committee. I'd like you to be on that team, maybe even as a team lead if you perform well. It would be a significant step up for you. It was almost funny how he described it as the analysis we presented, as if I'd been involved at all. He was offering me a promotion based on my own stolen work, expecting me to be grateful for the opportunity. That sounds interesting, I said, keeping my expression neutral. Can I think about it for a few days? His smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. Of course, take your time, but Shanice, I hope you understand that opportunities like this don't come along often. You'd be wise not to pass it up. The implicit threat was clear: accept his offer or face professional consequences. But he had no idea that in less than 2 weeks, none of his threats would matter anymore. That evening, I had dinner with Jamal, the IT specialist who'd helped me record the executive presentation. He'd become an unexpected ally and friend during this strange time, someone who understood what I was fighting against and supported me without expecting anything in return. Over Thai food in a quiet restaurant, I told him about Demetrius's offer, being careful not to reveal my uncle's acquisition plans. He's trying to lock you in, Jamal said immediately. If you accept that promotion, it becomes harder for you to speak out about what he did. You become complicit in the system because you're benefiting from it now. I nodded, having reached the same conclusion. I'm not going to accept it, but I have to be strategic about how I decline. I can't tip my hand about what's coming. What is coming? Jamal asked. I know you've been planning something. You've got that look people get when they're about to burn the whole building down. I smiled at his perception. Let's just say that justice delayed isn't justice denied. It's justice being properly prepared, and it's almost ready. The acquisition announcement came on a Tuesday morning, delivered through official channels, and accompanied by a press release that sent shockwaves through the Seattle financial community. Marcus Wellington, through his various investment vehicles, had acquired controlling interest in Westbrook Financial Group and was assuming the role of executive chairman, effective immediately. A comprehensive review of firm operations and culture would begin at once, led by external consultants. I was sitting at my desk when the email went out to all staff, watching the reactions ripple through the office. Confusion at first, then concern as people began Googling my uncle's name and discovering his reputation for aggressive restructuring that often involved significant personnel changes. Demetrius emerged from his office looking pale and shaken, his phone pressed to his ear as he tried to reach someone, probably his contacts in the executive suite. Our eyes met across the office floor, and I saw the exact moment when suspicion began to dawn in his expression. He knew my last name was Wellington, and now he was wondering if there was a connection, if somehow this acquisition was related to our conflict. But he couldn't quite believe it yet, couldn't imagine that a junior analyst he'd dismissed so casually could have connections powerful enough to threaten him. The official announcement named me as the lead internal consultant on the restructuring project, reporting directly to my uncle. That's when the whispers started, when people began putting together that Wellington was my maiden name, that the new executive chairman was my uncle, that I'd been working on this from the inside for weeks. Demetrius requested a meeting with me within an hour of the announcement, his assistant sending a carefully worded email that tried to sound professional while barely concealing panic. I agreed to meet him in one of the small conference rooms, wanting witnesses nearby if things got ugly. He arrived looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour, his usual polish completely gone. He closed the door and turned to face me, his expression cycling between anger, fear, and desperate calculation. "You're Marcus Wellington's niece," he said flatly. "You could have mentioned that." "You never asked about my family," I replied calmly, "and it didn't seem relevant to my job performance or the quality of my work, the work you presented as your own to the executive committee." He flinched at the directness of the accusation. "Shanice, I think there's been some misunderstandings between us, miscommunications about roles and credit and expectations, but I'm sure we can clear all that up, move forward productively." It was pathetic watching him try to rewrite history now that the power dynamic had shifted. "There's no misunderstanding, Demetrius. You stole my work, presented it as your own, and tried to reduce me to a footnote as a research associate. I have recordings of the executive presentation where you claimed every finding as your own discovery. I have documentation of the entire project timeline showing my conception and execution. And I have testimonies from 3 other women you've done this to over the years." His face went white. "What do you want?" It was the question I'd been waiting for, the moment when my former tormentor realized he was at my mercy. "I want you to resign," I said clearly. "Today, effective immediately. Write a letter to the executive committee admitting that the renewable energy analysis was primarily the work of Shanice Wellington and that you inappropriately claimed credit for her research. Then leave this firm and never work in this industry again." "You can't force me to resign," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're right, I can't force you," I agreed. "But my uncle can, and he will, once I present him with the evidence I've compiled. The only question is whether you leave quietly with some dignity intact, or whether you get fired publicly and have all of this documented in detail for anyone who Googles your name to find." He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw hatred burning in his eyes, but also resignation. He'd lost, and he knew it. You think you've won? He said bitterly. You think this makes you better than me, getting your rich uncle to fight your battles? I don't need to be better than you, Demetrius. I just need to be free of you and make sure you can't do to anyone else what you did to me and to Keisha and to all the others. That's not winning, that's just basic justice. He left the conference room without another word, and 3 hours later, his resignation letter was submitted to HR. The official story was that he was leaving to pursue other opportunities. But everyone at the firm knew the truth. He'd been pushed out by the new ownership, a casualty of the restructuring. In the weeks that followed, two other senior partners who'd been identified as problematic also resigned or were terminated. My uncle brought in new leadership committed to changing the firm's culture, implementing real mentorship programs, creating clear processes for crediting work, and establishing genuine accountability for those who exploited junior staff. I was offered a position as a senior analyst with a significant pay increase and the promise of partnership track if I performed well. More importantly, I was given control over the renewable energy investment division, building it from the ground up with proper recognition for the work that had started everything. 6 months after the acquisition, I was invited to present my renewable energy analysis, properly credited this time, at a major industry conference. As I stood on that stage, looking out at hundreds of financial professionals, I thought about the version of myself who'd sat in that storage closet recording Demetrius's theft, feeling powerless and defeated. That woman would barely recognize who I'd become, someone with real authority and resources, someone whose voice mattered and whose work was properly valued. But I also knew that my story was a rare one, that most people who face workplace theft and exploitation don't have a wealthy uncle with the means to acquire their company and right the wrongs. Most people have to fight much harder battles with far fewer resources, and many of them lose, despite being right. That's why I've made it part of my mission at the restructured Westbrook to mentor junior analysts, especially women and people of color, to help them document their work, protect their intellectual property, and navigate the political realities of corporate culture. I want to be the sponsor and advocate for others that I wish I'd had from the beginning. My personal life has also found a new equilibrium. My ex-husband and I finalized our divorce amicably, both of us acknowledging that we'd grown into different people with incompatible life paths. I've started dating again, casually, with no rush to jump into another serious relationship. I've reconnected with family in Atlanta and built a stronger relationship with my uncle, who's become an unexpected mentor and ally. And I've learned that justice, when it comes, is sweeter than any revenge fantasy because it's real and lasting and creates positive change beyond just personal satisfaction. The day I'll never forget, though, the day when everything could have gone so differently, was that rainy morning 6 months ago when Demetrius threw me out of the building, literally escorting me to the exit and telling me I was finished in this industry, that I should find another line of work because I clearly didn't have what it takes to succeed in finance. He'd been so confident, so certain of his power and my powerlessness. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that as I stood there in the rain, humiliated and defeated, my uncle was pulling up in his Rolls Royce, having heard from my mother about the conflict and deciding to see for himself what was happening. My uncle stepped out of that car, impeccably dressed as always, and looked at me standing there soaked and crying. Then he looked at Demetrius, who'd followed me out to make sure I left, and something cold and final settled over his features. "Is there a problem here?" my uncle asked quietly. Demetrius, not recognizing him, made his fatal mistake. "No problem, just a disgruntled employee who's being let go. Sir, this is a private matter. I'll have to ask you to move along." My uncle smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "I don't think I will. You see, the young woman you just threw out in the rain is my niece, and I think you and I need to have a conversation about how your firm treats its employees." I'll never forget the look on Demetrius's face as realization dawned, as he understood that the nobody he'd just humiliated had connections that could destroy him. He tried to backtrack, to claim misunderstanding, but it was too late. The wheels were already in motion. That moment in the rain, that intersection of my lowest point with unexpected rescue and power, changed the entire trajectory of my life. It gave me not just revenge, but something better, the chance to create real change and help others avoid the exploitation I'd suffered. As I look back on that terrible day, I realize that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are also doorways to transformation, if we're brave enough to walk through them and wise enough to recognize the help when it arrives. Demetrius thought he was throwing me out of his kingdom, ending my career with a few cruel words. What he actually did was push me towards something much bigger, a chance to rebuild not just my own career, but an entire system that had protected predators like him for too long. And now, when I drive past that office building where it all happened, I don't feel anger or bitterness anymore. I feel gratitude. Gratitude for my uncle's intervention, yes, but also gratitude for the experience itself, for learning exactly how the world works and how to fight back when it tries to crush you. Demetrius was right about one thing. I was finished being naive, finished accepting injustice, finished letting other people define my worth and my future. And that kind of finished was the best thing that ever happened to me. The months following the restructuring brought changes I could never have anticipated, some wonderful and some surprisingly complicated. The renewable energy division I was building attracted significant attention in the financial press, partly because of the quality of the research, and partly because the story of how that research nearly got stolen had leaked through industry gossip networks. I became something of a minor celebrity in certain circles, the analyst who'd stood up to workplace exploitation and won, though the reality was much more nuanced than that simple narrative suggested. What the press stories didn't capture was how difficult it was to navigate my new position at Westbrook. I'd gone from junior analyst to senior leadership almost overnight, and not everyone was happy about it. Some people saw my promotion as pure nepotism, the boss's niece getting special treatment regardless of merit. Others resented the changes being implemented under my consultation, the new accountability measures, and credit attribution systems that made it harder to take advantage of junior staff, but also required more documentation and transparency from everyone. I had to prove myself constantly, had to demonstrate that my rapid rise was based on genuine talent and not just family connections. Every analysis I produced was scrutinized more carefully than others, every recommendation questioned more thoroughly. It was exhausting, but it was also motivating. I wanted no one to be able to claim I hadn't earned my place. Keisha, the woman who'd warned me about Demetrius, reached out a few weeks after the acquisition announcement. We met for coffee, and I was happy to tell her that my uncle was interested in hiring her back in a senior position, with a formal apology for how she'd been treated and compensation for the career damage she'd suffered. She cried when I told her, not from sadness, but from relief that someone finally believed her and was willing to make things right. You know what the worst part was? She told me that day. Not even the stolen work or the forced resignation, but the gaslighting. The way they made me feel like I was crazy for being upset, like I was a problem for not going along with how things worked. Having someone validate that I was right all along, that means more than the money or the job. I understood exactly what she meant. Validation after being told you're wrong, that you're too sensitive or too ambitious or too aggressive, that's its own form of justice. Keisha came back to Westbrook and became one of my closest allies in reshaping the firm's culture. Her experience gave her credibility with other analysts who'd been mistreated, and together we built support networks and mentorship programs that were actually meaningful rather than just corporate window dressing. My relationship with my uncle deepened during this time as well. We had weekly dinners where we'd discuss business strategy, but we'd also talk about family history, about his experiences building his fortune, and the obstacles he'd faced. I learned that he'd had his own encounters with workplace exploitation early in his career, that his drive to acquire and restructure troubled companies came partly from a desire to create the kind of workplaces he wished had existed when he was starting out. Power without purpose is just ego, he told me one evening. I've made a lot of money, and that's satisfying in its way. But what really matters is what you do with that power. Do you use it to protect your own position, or do you use it to create opportunities for others? That's the question that determines whether your success means anything beyond your bank account. Those conversations shaped how I thought about my own career trajectory. I didn't want to just climb the corporate ladder. I wanted to change what the ladder looked like, who had access to it, and what happened to people once they reached different rungs. My romantic life, surprisingly, also found new dimension during this period. I'd been on a few casual dates, but nothing serious, still processing my divorce and focused primarily on work. Then one evening at an industry networking event, I met someone who would become important in unexpected ways. His name was Terrence Cho, a journalist who covered the financial sector for a major business publication. He'd been following the Westbrook story and wanted to interview me for a profile piece about workplace transformation in the investment industry. I was hesitant at first, worried about drawing too much attention or seeming like I was seeking publicity, but my uncle encouraged me to do it. Your story matters, he said, not because it makes you look good, but because it might inspire others who are facing similar situations. And it sends a message to the industry that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated anymore. So I agreed to the interview, which Terrence conducted over several meetings, wanting to understand not just the facts, but the emotional journey I'd been through. He was thoughtful and careful with his questions, never pushing for salacious details, but genuinely trying to understand the systemic issues that had enabled Demetrius's behavior. The article he eventually published was brilliant, fair, and thorough, examining not just my individual story, but the broader pattern of exploitation in elite financial firms. It interviewed Keisha and two other women who'd had similar experiences at different companies, creating a picture of an industry wide problem rather than isolated incidents. The response to the article was overwhelming. I received hundreds of emails from people sharing their own stories of workplace theft and exploitation, thanking me for speaking out, asking for advice on how to fight back. Some of the stories were heartbreaking. People who'd lost careers and reputations defending their work, people who'd been gaslit so effectively they'd started doubting their own memories and judgment. I couldn't respond to all of them personally, there were simply too many, but I worked with Keisha and others to create resources, a guide for documenting your work, steps to take if you suspect, credit theft, how to find legal representation if you need it, what to expect if you decide to fight back. We put together a website and made everything freely available. The project grew beyond what I'd imagined, attracting attention from labor rights organizations and eventually leading to legislative proposals around intellectual property protections for employees. Terrence and I stayed in touch after the article published, initially to discuss the response and potential follow up stories, but gradually our conversations became more personal. He was Korean American, 32 years old, divorced like me, and equally passionate about justice and accountability. We found ourselves talking for hours about everything from financial regulation to our favorite movies to what we wanted our lives to look like in 10 years. Our first real date was almost accidental, a work dinner that extended into the evening as we realized neither of us wanted it to end. He was easy to talk to, genuinely, interested in my thoughts and experiences, and refreshingly direct about his own vulnerabilities and mistakes. I got divorced because I was married to my career, he told me over our third bottle of wine, well past any pretense that this was a professional meeting. I traveled constantly, chased stories obsessively, and convinced myself that the work justified any personal sacrifice. By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late. My ex-wife had already decided she deserved better than being second priority forever. I understood that pattern all too well, having lived a version of it myself. Do you regret it? The career focus? I regret the imbalance, he said thoughtfully. I don't regret the work itself. Journalism matters, and I'm good at it. But I regret not learning earlier how to maintain relationships while pursuing ambitious goals. I'm trying to be better at that now. We started seeing each other regularly after that, taking it slow but enjoying each other's company. He understood the demands of my work in a way my ex husband never had, and I appreciated his perspective on the stories I was part of and helping create. It was a different kind of relationship than my marriage had been, more equal and more intentional, both of us bringing hard won wisdom about what we needed and what we could offer. About 8 months after the acquisition, Westbrook hosted its annual gala, a major fundraiser and networking event that typically attracted hundreds of people from across the financial industry. In previous years, I'd attended as a junior analyst, spending the evening serving drinks and making small talk while the senior partners conducted the real business. This year, I was one of the featured speakers, presenting an update on the renewable energy division and its performance. I was nervous as I prepared my remarks, aware that this was my first major public appearance in my new role at such a high profile event. My mother flew in from Atlanta to attend, and my uncle would be introducing me. Terrence would be there covering the event for his publication. It felt like a test, a moment where I'd either prove myself or reveal that I wasn't ready for this level of responsibility. The gala was held at a luxury hotel overlooking Elliott Bay, the kind of venue where everything from the lighting to the flower arrangements was designed to impress. I wore a deep blue gown that my mother had helped me pick out, elegant and professional, but also beautiful, a statement that I belonged in these spaces and wouldn't apologize for taking up room. As I moved through the cocktail reception before dinner, I was struck by how different the dynamic was from previous years. People wanted to talk to me now, to hear about the renewable energy division, to discuss the reforms at Westbrook, to share their own experiences with workplace challenges. Some of the attention was genuine interest, but some felt opportunistic, people who sensed which way the wind was blowing and wanted to align themselves with whatever was succeeding. I was talking to a group of investors about solar technology deployment in East Africa when I saw Demetrius across the room. He'd somehow secured an invitation despite being unemployed, probably through one of his old connections who either hadn't heard about his downfall or had chosen to support him anyway. Our eyes met, and I saw a flash of something ugly in his expression before he turned away. My uncle noticed the moment and came to my side. "You okay?" I nodded, not trusting my voice for a second. Seeing Demetrius again brought back all the anger and hurt I thought I'd processed, the feeling of powerlessness and humiliation that had defined those terrible weeks. "Want me to have him removed?" my uncle asked quietly. "I can't believe anyone would invite him after what he did." "No," I said, surprising myself with the decision. "Let him stay. Let him see what I've built from the work he tried to steal. That's better than kicking him out." My uncle smiled proudly and squeezed my shoulder. "You're stronger than I was at your age. I would have thrown him out just for the satisfaction of it." When it came time for my presentation, I walked to the stage feeling more confident than I had all evening. The presence of my former tormentor in the audience oddly steadied me, reminding me why this work mattered and why I couldn't let fear or imposter syndrome make me smaller than I was. I delivered my remarks clearly and passionately, outlining the renewable energy division's first-year performance. We'd identified 3 investment opportunities that were already showing significant returns, established partnerships with development organizations in 5 countries, and created a framework for responsible investing that prioritized both profit and positive social impact. The audience responded enthusiastically, and when I finished, there was genuine applause, not just the polite golf claps that usually punctuate corporate speeches. During the Q&A section, someone asked how I'd managed to build such a successful division so quickly at my age. It was the kind of question that could be taken multiple ways: genuine curiosity or subtle skepticism about whether I'd really earned my position. "I'd love to say it was all genius and hard work," I said honestly, but the truth is that most of this analysis existed over a year ago. I spent 3 months researching these opportunities when I was a junior analyst, identifying the precise investments we're now pursuing. What's different now is that I have the authority and resources to act on my own research rather than watching someone else take credit for it and then never implementing the recommendations. The room got very quiet, and I saw people exchanging glances, aware that I was referencing my conflict with Demetrius without naming him directly. That experience taught me something crucial, I continued. The best ideas mean nothing if they come from people who aren't empowered to execute them. Real innovation requires creating environments where talent at every level is recognized and supported, not exploited. That's what we're building at Westbrook, a firm where your voice matters based on the quality of your work, not your seniority or your connections. The applause after that response was even louder, and I saw several young analysts in the audience nodding vigorously. I'd spoken to their experience, validated their frustration with systems that valued hierarchy over merit. After my presentation, I was surrounded by people wanting to continue the conversation, but I caught sight of Demetrius pushing toward the exit. On impulse, I excused myself and followed him into the hallway outside the ballroom. Demetrius, I called out. He stopped but didn't turn around immediately, his shoulders tense. When he finally faced me, his expression was carefully controlled, revealing nothing. That was quite a performance in there, he said. Very inspirational, very feel good. I'm sure everyone feels very good about themselves now. His bitterness was palpable, and I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't satisfaction either. Is that why you came tonight? To see what became of the work you tried to take? He laughed harshly. You think you've won some great victory, but you've just played the game at a different level. Used your family connections to destroy my career while pretending it was about justice and integrity. How is that any different from what you accused me of doing? I didn't destroy your career, Demetrius. You did that yourself when you made exploitation your standard operating procedure. I just made sure you face consequences for it. Consequences, he repeated mockingly. You mean revenge. You couldn't handle that the industry works a certain way, that junior people pay dues and senior people get credit. So you ran to your rich uncle and had him buy your way to the top, and now you're giving speeches about merit and fairness. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. I felt my temper flare, but forced myself to stay calm. You're right that I had advantages you didn't account for, that I had family resources most people don't. But that doesn't change what you did or make it acceptable. You stole work from multiple people over years, damaged careers, violated trust. The fact that you can't see how wrong that was, that you're still justifying it as just how the industry works, that's exactly why you needed to be removed. He studied me for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, resignation mixed with grudging respect. You know what the worst part is? The renewable energy division you're running is going to be hugely successful. I saw that when you first presented the research to me, saw the potential, and now I get to watch you succeed with my idea. It was never your idea, I said firmly. You wouldn't even have known about these opportunities if I hadn't researched them, analyzed them, presented them to you. You saw potential in my work, not in some idea you generated yourself, and that's the fundamental difference between us. I create value, you try to appropriate it. One of those approaches builds something lasting, the other just extracts and depletes. He had no response to that, and after a moment he turned and walked away, disappearing into the elevator without looking back. I stood in that hallway feeling emotionally drained, but also lighter somehow, as if the confrontation had closed a chapter that needed ending. When I returned to the gala, Terrence was waiting near the entrance, concern on his face. Everything okay? I saw you follow him out. Yeah, I said, taking his offered arm. Everything's okay. Better than okay, actually. I think I finally let go of the anger I've been carrying around. He smiled and kissed my forehead. Good, because you have about 50 more people in there who want to talk to you about job opportunities and investment proposals and probably marriage proposals, knowing how tonight went. I laughed, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months. The evening continued with countless conversations, business cards exchanged, possibilities discussed. My mother was radiant with pride, introducing me to old family friends and telling anyone who'd listen about her daughter, the financial executive. My uncle held court in his own circle, but caught my eye several times across the room, his approval evident. As the night wound down and guests began filtering out, I found myself on the hotel balcony looking out at the city lights, reflected on the dark water of the bay. Seattle had been the site of my greatest professional humiliation, but it had also become the place where I'd found my power and purpose. The city felt different now, less hostile and more full of potential. Terrence joined me on the balcony, shrugging off his jacket and draping it over my shoulders against the cool night air. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, processing the evening. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. "Do you think you would have become the person you are now if Demetrius hadn't stolen your work? If everything had gone smoothly and you'd gotten proper credit from the beginning?" It was a question I'd asked myself many times. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe I would have had a good career, steady progression, made partner eventually, but I don't think I would have understood how the system really works or felt compelled to change it. Sometimes it takes having something taken from you to understand what's worth fighting for. And was it worth it? The pain and uncertainty and struggle? I considered that carefully. At the time, it felt like the worst thing that could happen to me. The betrayal, the divorce happening simultaneously, feeling like I'd failed at everything that mattered. But looking back, that breakdown led to breakthrough. I found strength I didn't know I had, connections to family I'd neglected, purpose beyond just career success. So, yes, it was worth it, even though I wouldn't want to go through it again. He nodded thoughtfully. That's going into the follow up piece I'm writing, by the way, the longer term impact of workplace trauma and how people rebuild after it. I smiled. "Always working, aren't you?" says the woman who spent her entire cocktail hour talking business. We laughed together, and it felt good, felt normal in a way that was still new, but becoming more familiar. The trauma of what I'd been through was real and had left marks, but it didn't define me anymore. I was building something new, something that honored the struggle while moving beyond it. The next year brought continued growth for both the renewable energy division and my personal life. The investments we'd made began generating significant returns, validating the research I'd done and the strategic vision I'd developed. Westbrook's reputation in sustainable investing grew, attracting new clients and talent. Other firms began implementing similar reforms to their crediting and mentorship systems, partly because it was the right thing to do, but also because they were losing talented people to companies that treated them better. My relationship with Terrence deepened into something serious and committed, though we both maintained our independence and career focus. He covered major stories that took him around the world, and I traveled frequently for investments and partnerships. But we made time for each other in intentional ways. Weekends away from technology and work obligations, long conversations about our hopes and fears, building the kind of partnership that could sustain both individual ambition and shared life. We didn't rush toward marriage or cohabitation. Both of us having learned from our first marriages that legal commitment means nothing without emotional foundation. But we talked about futures that included each other, about what we wanted to build together once we were both ready. Keisha flourished in her restored position at Westbrook, eventually becoming a managing director and one of the firm's most respected voices on ethical business practices. We remained close friends and collaborators, our shared experience of exploitation creating a bond that transcended normal professional relationships. Together with several other women who'd faced similar challenges, we started a nonprofit organization focused on supporting people who were fighting workplace injustice. We provided resources, connections to legal help, mentorship, and most importantly, validation that their experiences were real and their anger was justified. We called it the Wellington Initiative, using my uncle's name with his enthusiastic permission and financial support. The organization grew quickly, fueled by a demand that suggested just how widespread workplace exploitation really was. We helped hundreds of people document their cases, connect with ethical employment lawyers, and when appropriate, fight back against companies and individuals who'd stolen their work or damaged their careers. Not every case ended in triumph. The system is still heavily weighted toward institutional power, and many people faced retaliation for speaking out. But enough cases resulted in justice, in apologies and restorations and reforms that momentum began building. The culture started shifting, slowly but measurably, toward accountability. One of the most satisfying moments came about 18 months after the Westbrook acquisition. I received a LinkedIn message from a young woman who'd been following my story. She was a junior analyst at a competing firm, and her supervisor was pulling exactly the same playbook Demetrius had used on me, grooming her, praising her research, then positioning himself to present it as his own work. But unlike me in my naive early days, she'd been documenting everything from the beginning. She had timestamps on her files, email trails, even recordings of conversations where the supervisor explicitly praised her work before claiming it. She reached out asking for advice on how to proceed, whether to confront the supervisor, whether to go to HR, whether to just quit and cut her losses. I talked to her on the phone for over an hour, sharing my experience and the lessons I'd learned. I connected her with lawyers through the Wellington Initiative, and I did something I wouldn't have been able to do before. I offered her a position at Westbrook if she wanted an exit strategy that didn't sacrifice her career. She ended up staying at her firm, but using the documentation she'd gathered to file a formal complaint that resulted in her supervisor being removed and her receiving proper credit and a significant promotion. She credited my story with giving her the courage to fight back, knowing that justice was possible even if it was difficult. You change what's possible for people like me, she told me when we met in person later. Before your story became public, I would have just accepted that this was how things worked. But you showed that there's another path. Those words meant more to me than any promotion or award. The idea that my painful experience could become a roadmap for others, that it could prevent even one person from suffering what I'd suffered, that made everything worthwhile. My family relationships also evolved in unexpected ways during this time. My mother and I grew closer, having more honest conversations about her own career challenges and the compromises she'd made. She told me stories I'd never heard before about discrimination she'd faced in the corporate world of the 80s and 90s, about times she'd wanted to fight back but hadn't because she'd had kids to support and couldn't risk her income. "I'm so proud that you didn't back down," she told me one evening over wine. Uh, no, it was partly because you had your uncle's support and resources I didn't have, but it was also because you have courage I never quite found. You remind me of your grandmother. She never accepted injustice either. My relationship with my uncle became one of the most important in my life. He became not just a business mentor, but a genuine friend, someone I could talk to about everything from investment strategy to relationship challenges to the weight of having power and trying to use it responsibly. He introduced me to his network of other Black executives and entrepreneurs, people who'd built empires despite facing obstacles I was only beginning to understand. These connections taught me that my story, while dramatic in its specifics, was part of a much larger narrative about who gets opportunities and who has to fight for them. Every generation pushes the door open a little wider, one of my uncle's friends told me at a dinner party. Your generation is fighting battles my generation wasn't positioned to fight yet, and the next generation will fight battles you can't imagine now. That's progress, incremental and frustrating, but real. As the 2-year anniversary of the acquisition approached, my uncle announced his intention to step back from day-to-day management of Westbrook and transition to a chairman emeritus role. He'd accomplished what he'd set out to do, restructure the firm, establish new cultural norms, and position it for sustainable success. Now he wanted to focus on his other investments and spend more time with family. "Who do you think should take over as CEO?" I asked him during one of our regular dinners. He gave me a look that suggested the answer should be obvious. The firm needs someone who understands both the business fundamentals and the cultural transformation we've been implementing, someone who's earned the respect of the staff through actual leadership rather than just tenure, someone who has vision for where we're going. Next. "You're talking about me," I said, feeling a mixture of excitement and terror. "I'm 29 years old. Nobody's going to accept a 29-year-old CEO of a major investment firm." "You're almost 30, he corrected with a smile. "And yes, some people won't accept it initially. But you've proven yourself over the past 2 years in every way that matters. The renewable energy division is the firm's fastest growing sector. The reforms you've championed have improved talent retention by 40%. Client satisfaction is at an all-time high. Those are the numbers that matter, not your age." It's going to look like nepotism, I protested. The boss's niece getting the top job. It is nepotism, he said bluntly. I'm choosing you partly because you're family and I trust you completely. But I'm also choosing you because you're the most qualified person for this role. And if you weren't my niece, I'd still be choosing you. The people who matter will see that, and the people who don't see it aren't worth worrying about. The announcement of my appointment as CEO came 3 months later, after a careful transition process that included input from the board and senior leadership team. The response was mixed as expected. The internal reaction was mostly positive. People who'd worked with me understood my qualifications and supported the decision. The external reaction was more skeptical, with financial press articles questioning whether I was ready for this responsibility and whether my rapid rise was merit-based or purely family connection. I didn't let the skepticism shake me. I'd spent 2 years proving myself in increasingly challenging roles, and I knew my capabilities. More importantly, I knew the vision I wanted to implement for Westbrook's future, expanding our sustainable investing focus, continuing to reform industry practices around credit and recognition, using our platform to advocate for systemic changes in how financial firms operate. My first major decision as CEO was to establish a company wide profit sharing program that extended beyond just senior partners, ensuring that when the firm succeeded, everyone who contributed to that success benefited financially. It was a radical move in an industry built on concentrating wealth at the top, and it generated both praise and criticism from competitors. You're setting a precedent that other firms will hate you for, one industry veteran told me at a conference. If you prove that this model can work, you're going to force everyone else to consider implementing similar programs. That makes you dangerous. Good, I replied. This industry needs to be disrupted. If being dangerous is what it takes to create more equitable workplaces, I'll accept that label. The profit sharing program, combined with our continued focus on crediting work appropriately and creating genuine advancement opportunities, made Westbrook one of the most attractive employers in the Seattle financial sector. We started receiving applications from top talent at competing firms, people who were tired of traditional hierarchies and wanted to work somewhere that valued contributions over politics. 3 years after that rainy day when Demetrius had thrown me out of the building declaring I was finished, I stood in that same spot on a sunny Seattle afternoon. The building looked the same from the outside, the same glass and steel tower reaching toward the sky. But everything else had changed. I wasn't the defeated junior analyst anymore, soaked and humiliated and feeling like her life was ending. I was the CEO of a transformed firm, someone who'd taken her worst professional experience and used it as a catalyst for systemic change. My uncle's Rolls Royce pulled up to the curb, the same car that had appeared that terrible day, like a deus ex machina rescuing me from my lowest moment. He stepped out, older now, but still commanding presence and respect. Thought I'd pick you up for lunch, said. Figured it would be meaningful to recreate that day, but with a better ending. I laughed and hugged him. The ending's been pretty good so far. We drove through downtown Seattle, talking about everything and nothing. The comfortable conversation of people who've been through crisis together and come out stronger. At lunch, he told me about his plans to gradually hand over control of his other investments to the next generation, wanting to spend his later years focused on philanthropy and family rather than constant business warfare. I'm proud of what we built together, he said over coffee. Not just the financial success, though that's certainly satisfying, but the culture we created, the people we've helped, the industry standards we've influenced. That's legacy that matters beyond quarterly earnings. I couldn't have done any of it without you, I said honestly. When you showed up that day, when you believed me and gave me the resources to fight back, you changed my entire life trajectory. I gave you resources, he corrected gently, but you did the work. You had the intelligence to build the case, the courage to pursue justice even when it was hard, the vision to transform crisis into opportunity. I'm proud to be your uncle, Shanice, and I'm honored to have played a role in your success. But never forget that the success itself is yours. As I drove back to the office that afternoon, I thought about how many lives had changed because of that one terrible morning. Mine, obviously, but also Keisha's. Restored to her career and thriving. The hundreds of people we'd helped through the Wellington Initiative. The analysts at Westbrook who now worked in an environment that valued and protected them. The industry practices that were slowly shifting because we'd demonstrated an alternative model. Even Demetrius's life had changed, though not in ways he would have chosen. I'd heard through the grapevine that he'd left Seattle entirely, moved to a smaller city where his reputation hadn't preceded him, taken a job at a regional firm at a fraction of his former status and salary. He'd lost everything he'd built through exploitation, which felt like appropriate justice even if I took no particular pleasure in his downfall. The goal had never been to destroy him, but to stop him from destroying others. The sun was setting over Puget Sound as I returned to my office, the sky painted in brilliant oranges and purples. I stood at my window, looking out over the city, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. There would be more challenges ahead, I knew that. More obstacles and setbacks and moments of doubt. The work of changing systems and cultures is never finished. It's an ongoing process that requires constant vigilance and adaptation. But I was ready for those challenges in a way I hadn't been 3 years ago. I understood now how power worked, how to build coalitions, how to fight battles worth fighting, and let go of ones that weren't. I'd learned that justice doesn't always come quickly or easily, but that it's worth pursuing even when the odds seem impossible. My phone buzzed with a message from Terrence. Dinner tonight. I have news about a new investigation I think you'll find interesting. I smiled and replied that I'd be there. My professional life was fulfilling and meaningful, but so was the personal life I'd rebuilt from the ruins of my first marriage. I'd learned that you don't have to choose between career success and personal happiness. You just have to be intentional about how you build both and find partners who support your full humanity. Before leaving the office, I checked my email one last time and saw a message that stopped me cold. It was from a law firm representing a former junior analyst at a competing firm who was suing for intellectual property theft. The case details were hauntingly familiar, almost identical to what I'd experienced with Demetrius. The lawyer was reaching out because they'd read about my story and wanted to know if I'd be willing to serve as an expert witness, providing testimony about industry practices and the pattern of exploitation I'd observed and fought against. I responded immediately, agreeing to help in whatever way I could. This was exactly why I'd gone public with my story so that others facing similar injustice would know they weren't alone and would have resources to fight back. The work continued, the transformation kept unfolding, one case and one victory, and one person empowered at a time. As I drove home that evening, I passed the old office building where it had all begun, where I'd stood in the rain, feeling defeated and destroyed. I didn't stop or slow down, didn't need to memorialize that moment anymore. It was part of my history, but it didn't define my present or limit my future. The woman who'd been thrown out of that building with nothing had built something remarkable from that nothing, had taken her pain and transformed it into purpose, had turned her vulnerability into power that she used to protect others. That rainy morning, Demetrius had declared I was finished. And he'd been right. I was finished being underestimated, finished accepting injustice, finished playing by rules designed to keep me powerless. But I wasn't finished building, creating, leading, or fighting for the kind of world I wanted to live in. That work would never be finished, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The story people tell about me now is simple. Young analyst gets exploited, wealthy uncle rescues her, justice prevails, everyone lives happily ever after. It's a good story, satisfying in its arc of wronged protagonist achieving vindication. But the real story is more complicated and more interesting. It's about how systems of power operate, how they protect some people and exploit others, how they can be changed, but only through sustained effort and strategic action. It's about the difference between revenge and justice, between personal vindication and structural transformation. It's about the privilege of having resources and the responsibility that comes with that privilege. And it's about how the worst moments of our lives, The times when we feel most defeated and broken can become the foundation for something powerful and meaningful if we refuse to let them define us as victims. I'm not a hero of this story. I'm just someone who got angry enough to fight back, lucky enough to have help when I needed it, and stubborn enough to turn personal grievance into broader purpose. The real heroes are people like Keisha, who fought without family wealth backing them up, people who've sued their employers knowing it might destroy their careers, people who've spoken out about exploitation even when the system punished them for it. I just had a platform and used it, which is the bare minimum of what anyone should do with power and resources. But if my story can make it even slightly easier for the next person facing workplace theft, if it can provide a roadmap or a spark of hope, or just the knowledge that they're not crazy for being angry about injustice, then everything I went through had purpose beyond my own resolution. That's the legacy I want to build, not just a successful company or impressive investment returns, but a world where talent and hard work actually matter more than politics and exploitation, where calling out injustice doesn't require extraordinary courage because the systems are designed to support truth rather than protect power. We're not there yet, not even close, but we're further along than we were 3 years ago, and we'll be further along 3 years from now. Progress isn't a moment, it's a direction. And as long as we keep moving toward justice and accountability, eventually we'll get there. The rain had stopped by the time I got home, and the Seattle sky was clearing to reveal stars. I stood on my balcony looking up at them, thinking about all the people I'd met whose lives had intersected with mine through this journey. The good and the bad, the allies and the adversaries, the people who'd helped and the people who'd hurt, they'd all been part of the path that led here. I wasn't grateful for what Demetrius did to me, wasn't ready to say that everything happens for a reason or that his betrayal was secretly a blessing. What he did was wrong, and the system that protected him was broken, and the fact that I eventually found justice doesn't make the injustice acceptable. But I was grateful for who I'd become through fighting back, for the strength I'd discovered, for the relationships I'd built, for the purpose I'd found. That version of myself who'd stood in the rain 3 years ago, she would be proud of where we'd ended up, would be amazed by everything we'd accomplished and built. And that, more than any professional success or public recognition, was the true measure of whether the journey had been worth it. You like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. On the screen, you can see 2 new stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next story with love and respect.